The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting their bleached glow across Oak Creek Memorial's 4th floor. Katie Morrison stepped out of the elevator at 6:24 a.m., her shoes clicking against tile in rhythm with her heartbeat, steady, controlled, the way everything about her had been for the past 18 years. The smell of stale coffee and antiseptic hit first, then the deeper note of something chemical, something that never quite washed out of the walls. She carried a cardboard box containing a cracked mug, a fading photo tucked in her jacket pocket where no one would see it, and hands that had held too many dying men to ever truly stop shaking, though you'd never know it from looking at them now. Senior Chief Petty Officer Katie Morrison didn't exist anymore. Not officially. Not according to the men in Arlington who'd ordered her to disappear 3 years ago when the operation in Baghdad went dark. The classified operation. The one that never happened, involving 12 soldiers she'd pulled from a burning Humvee while rounds came down like hail. The Pentagon had erased her name from every manifest, every record, every official acknowledgement of service. She was a ghost in a nurse's uniform, and that was exactly how she needed to stay. Her badge clipped to her scrubs identified her only as K. Morrison, RN. The credentials behind her were real, 23 years of actual nursing experience, references from 3 hospitals in different states, background clear as fresh water. No mention of the Special Operations Medical Corps. No mention of 3 Navy Crosses or the Bronze Stars or the Purple Heart she'd earned in places that officially didn't exist. Those belonged to a woman the government had killed on paper, and that woman was not permitted to resurface. The morning shift coordinator, a woman named Diane with purple reading glasses on a beaded chain, barely glanced up. Room assignments on the board. Your shadow rotation today with Senior RN Paulson. Don't touch anything without asking. Katie nodded, a slight dip of the chin, nothing more, and moved toward the nurse's station where Paulson was already charting with the deliberate speed of someone who'd been doing this for 40 years and had no patience left for surprises. What happened in the next 8 hours would plant the seeds of everything that followed. Katie's competence was the kind that didn't announce itself. She didn't speak during rounds. She didn't offer opinions. She simply existed in the spaces between the urgent and the routine, and in those spaces, she noticed things. She caught a drop for drip before contamination. She noticed when a post-op patient's breathing had shifted, not dramatically, but enough, and mentioned it quietly to the attending, who ordered an ultrasound and found early pneumothorax. She charted with the precision of someone who understood that medical records weren't just documentation, they were survival. Every vitals trend. Every medication time. Every notation that created a complete picture of each patient's journey through Oak Creek Memorial. It was this precision that caught Dr. Sterling's attention. He moved through the hospital like a man who'd never been told no, his tailored white coat creasing exactly where it was supposed to, a Rolex catching light beneath his cuff. Dr. Marcus Sterling, interventional cardiologist, had been running a side operation for almost 6 years. Minor one. Profitable. The kind of thing that only worked in hospitals where the oversight was thin and the right people had already been paid to look away. He'd cultivated relationships with a medical supply company, inflated invoices here, unnecessary procedures there, kickbacks deposited into accounts that didn't trace back to his name. $40,000 last month alone. $75,000 the month before. It was working perfectly until Katie Morrison started charting his cases. 3 weeks into her employment at Oak Creek Memorial, Sterling had reviewed her notes on a cardiac catheterization he'd performed on a patient who didn't need one. Her notes were meticulous. Specific. They documented his reasoning with such care that any competent auditor could see it didn't make sense. The timing was suspicious. The indication was borderline. The follow-up care suggested the procedure hadn't been necessary. Katie hadn't written a single accusation. She'd simply recorded the facts with such clarity that they spoke for themselves. That was worse than an accusation. Accusations could be dismissed. But facts had a way of surviving scrutiny. Sterling made his decision while sitting in his office that afternoon, expensive coffee cooling in a ceramic mug worth more than most people's car payments. He would accelerate her departure. A week, maybe 2. One of his board members owed him 3 favors. Another had made considerably more than his salary in the past 18 months. And there was always another hospital, another supply company, another city where people were easier to manage. He started with the public bet. The nurse's station was busy at shift change, 7 people charting, 1 phone ringing, someone laughing about plans for Friday night. Sterling walked in and leaned against the counter, unbuttoning his coat cuff with practiced casualness. "New staff member," he announced, looking directly at Katie without malice, without anger, with something that was almost worse, complete certainty. "I'm betting this one quits within a week. Anyone want to take that?" The room's energy shifted. Not dramatically. A subtle tension, the way a room changes when someone steps into it who shouldn't be there. Katie kept her eyes on her charting. 1 measured breath. In through the nose, out through the mouth, the way you controlled yourself when you were surrounded by enemies and needed to survive longer than they needed you gone. "Why would you say that?" one of the younger nurses asked. "Just a prediction," Sterling said, straightening his coat. "Some people aren't cut out for this environment. Too much pressure. Bad fit." He smiled, and the smile had teeth. "I give her 5 days. Maybe 6. He walked away before anyone could respond, before the moment could gather weight or resistance. That was his skill, landing the cut and leaving before you felt the pain. Behind him, the station grew quiet. Someone resumed typing. Someone else cleared their throat. Katie finished her note and moved toward the medicine room for the 8 p.m. medication distribution. "That was weird," Paulson said quietly, falling into step beside her. "Don't worry about him. He does this sometimes. Tests people." Katie didn't respond. She understood exactly what was happening. She'd been marked. She'd been made visible, and the only way to survive being visible was to become invisible again, to prove she didn't belong here, to give them no reason to look closer at the meticulous woman in the scrubs who noticed details that threatened the careful equilibrium of Oak Creek Memorial's protected corruption. But that wasn't the worst part. It came during the 4 p.m. admission, when the ER called with a post-operative transfer from a surgical case at Naval Medical Center San Diego. 43-year-old male, Army Ranger, admitted for routine post-op observation following an outpatient procedure. Room 304. Stable vitals. Standard protocol. Katie was assigning rooms when she saw the name on the admission slip. The way the letters arranged themselves seemed almost impossible. Captain James Morrison. Army Ranger, 75th Regiment. The unit patch described in the medical social history commanded 2nd Platoon, Charlie Company. Her hands didn't shake. They'd been trained not to. She knew that name. She'd seen it on an official letter, a commendation letter, the kind they sent to families of soldiers killed in combat, written in the formal language that military commands used when they were telling you your child had died a hero. Captain James Morrison had written that letter. He'd served with her son in Baghdad. He'd been her son's commanding officer during the firefight in the Jolan district 3 years ago, the same operation where she'd been a ghost in body armor, the one that had required her to disappear entirely. The same operation. The same day. And Captain Morrison was now lying in room 304, post-op and vulnerable, and Katie Morrison was the nurse assigned to monitor him. She stood perfectly still for 3 seconds. The ventilator on the 2nd floor wheezed its mechanical rhythm somewhere in the background. A monitor beeped its steady confirmation of human survival. Around her, the hospital moved forward with its ordinary business, people healing, people dying, people suspended between the two. Katie picked up the admission slip and walked toward room 304. The lunch rush at Oak Creek Memorial moved like a tide, nurses wheeling carts, doctors calling orders, the smell of antiseptic mixing with something that had been warming under heat lamps too long. Katie carried her tray through the cafeteria, a plate of something beige and unidentifiable, a cup of black coffee, a banana. She kept her head down. Kept her movements efficient. The cardinal rule of invisibility: occupy space without demanding it. Dr. Sterling sat at a corner table with 3 residents, his voice carrying the particular volume of a man accustomed to being heard. He wore a $4,000 watch that caught the fluorescent light as he gestured, speaking about the standards and nurse competency. Katie was within arm's reach when he turned, his elbow extending outward as if he'd been waiting for her to pass. The tray left her hands. Coffee exploded across the tile floor. The plate shattered into 7 pieces. She counted them before looking up. "Careful there, Chief," Sterling said, not moving from his seat. The residents around him fell silent. A practical nurse pushing a medication cart froze mid-step. These hallways can get so crowded. Easy to get knocked around if you're not paying attention. Katie didn't look at him. She crouched, began collecting pieces of ceramic in her hands. The coffee was still hot, she could feel the steam rising from the tile. A janitor appeared with a mop. Sterling took a sip of his own coffee and turned back to his audience. The conversation resumed as if nothing had happened. She stood, walked to the trash bin, and started her shift again. That was at 11:41 a.m. By 1:22 p.m., Dr. Sterling had positioned himself near the nurse's station with a stack of patient charts. Katie was documenting vitals from her morning rounds, meticulous notation, every measurement recorded to the decimal point. The charting that had caught his attention in the first place because it was too good, too precise, too careful. Nurses didn't chart like that unless they'd been trained to, and trained nurses didn't stay invisible. Sterling walked past her desk and dropped the charts. They scattered across the tile floor, pages fanning out like playing cards. The station went quiet. "Pick that up, sweetheart." His voice was conversational, almost friendly. "These files need to be organized. Wouldn't want anything to get lost." Katie felt it before she thought it, that old familiar shift in her spine, the one that came from learning, over 13 years of classified operations, that humiliation was a weapon. Just not hers. She could use it, but she wouldn't own it. That was the difference between a victim and a warrior. She took one measured breath. She looked up and met his eyes. Held them. Let a single tear escape, calculated, precise, and wiped it away without breaking contact. Her voice came out low and steady, shaped like a command. "I've survived worse men than you, Doctor." Sterling's jaw tightened. A resident actually took a step backward. The practical nurse by the medication cart suddenly found something very interesting to do in Bay 3. Katie bent and began collecting the charts. Her hands didn't shake. Her breathing didn't accelerate. She simply organized the papers, alphabetically, then by floor, and placed them back on his desk, each one aligned with the others. She returned to her documentation. The shift continued. What Sterling didn't understand, what nobody understood, was that the trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. It was 13 years of training in environments where a single emotional reaction meant death. It was the accumulated muscle memory of a woman who had held dying soldiers' hands in the dark, who had applied pressure to wounds in temperatures that would make civilians weep, who had made decisions that altered the course of entire operations by the simple fact of her presence and her steadiness. She had survived a mortar round that took her son's entire patrol. She had survived the government ordering her to forget she had a son at all. A man with an expensive watch and inherited arrogance wasn't going to break her with dropped trays and insults. But that wasn't the worst part. At 2:06 a.m., the emergency alarms came. A mass casualty arrival, soldiers from Fort Bragg, transport accident on I-5 near the airport, 14 minutes from Oak Creek Memorial's trauma bays. The intercom crackled with controlled urgency, and Katie felt something shift in her chest, something that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with remembering. The emergency department transformed in seconds. Beds were mobilized. For lines were set up on stands. The blood bank was notified. Trauma surgeons emerged from the surgical suites pulling on gowns. And Katie moved with the kind of precision that comes not from training but from having actually done this, in worse conditions, with less equipment, while artillery fire illuminated the desert. Dr. Sterling stood in Trauma Bay 1 as the first soldier was wheeled in, a young man with a femur fracture and potential abdominal trauma, blood pressure already dropping. Sterling reached for an 18-gauge for needle. His hands were slightly trembling. Katie watched from the doorway, still technically not assigned to this bay, not yet officially part of this crisis. "I need a central line," Sterling said. His voice had lost its arrogance. Now it just sounded thin. He attempted the subclavian approach on the first try. The needle went in at the wrong angle. Anyone who'd actually placed more than 30 central lines could see it in the way the syringe met resistance. He withdrew it. Tried again. The patient's BP was 78/52 now. The monitor showed tachycardia at 148 beats per minute. The resident beside him was pale, useless, waiting for leadership that wasn't coming. Katie stepped into the bay. She didn't ask permission. She reached for a 20-gauge central line kit, opened it with one hand, and said, "Step back." It wasn't a request. Sterling moved. The difference between then and now was like watching someone switch channels. Her voice had dropped an octave, and every person in that trauma bay had heard it and obeyed. The young soldier's chest was exposed now, his ribs visible, the anatomy as clear as a training model. Katie located the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, swabbed the site with chlorhexidine. Muscle memory took over. Her hands moved like they had done this 1,000 times. Because they had. The needle went in. There was resistance, pneumothorax, which meant air in the pleural space. She was already reaching for the decompression needle as the monitor showed what she'd known they'd find. The hiss of air escaping made a sound like a sigh. 85. 92. 100. The oxygen saturation climbed. The blood pressure stabilized. The monitor's rhythm evened out into something that resembled normal. The room went dead silent. Sterling's face had gone the color of old surgical tape. The resident was staring at Katie as if she'd just materialized from somewhere outside the hospital entirely. The trauma surgeon, a woman named Dr. Holloway with 22 years of experience and 3 tours in Afghanistan, stepped closer and said quietly, "Who trained you?" Katie didn't answer. She was looking at the soldier's chest, the steady rise and fall, the color already returning to his face. The monitors. The numbers. The evidence that he was alive because she'd moved, because she'd known exactly where to put the needle, exactly how much pressure to apply, exactly what his body would do in response. This was what she'd been running from. This exact moment. This was why the Pentagon had ordered her to disappear. Because when you could do this, when you possessed this particular set of skills and the judgment to deploy them, you became the kind of asset that governments kept and used and never truly let go. The next soldier was already being wheeled in. Then another. The chaos expanded and Katie moved with it, her hand steady, her voice low and commanding when it needed to be. Once, Dr. Sterling tried to give an order in one of the bays where she was working. Katie looked at him and said, "You're observing now, Doctor." He observed. It wasn't until 4:38 a.m., when the last patient had been stabilized and the night shift had transitioned to day, that Katie walked out of the trauma bays and realized what she'd just done. She'd revealed herself. Not completely, not yet, but enough. There were security cameras in those bays. There were residents and nurses and physicians who would start asking questions about where she'd learned to place a central line while maintaining perfect composure during a mass casualty event. There were videos now, documentation, evidence of a skill set that didn't match her file. She needed to disappear again. But first, she needed to see room 304. The code blue alarm sounded at 2:56 a.m. 3 short bursts of sound that made the fluorescent light seem to flicker in response. Katie was restocking the supply cart on the 3rd floor when the intercom crackled, "Code blue, room 304, and her entire body went still. Not still like shock. Still like a weapon chambering around. She moved before her brain caught up. Down the corridor. Past the nursing station. The hallway lights reflected off the polished tile in streaks of white that seemed to stretch toward the room like a runway. Her shoes made no sound. Years of training meant she'd learned to walk like wind moving through empty space. Room 304 was chaos wrapped in professional language. The monitor showed a flat, wavering line. Captain Morrison's body lay motionless under the white sheet, his chest barely rising. Two nurses stood frozen near the bed. Dr. Sterling stood at the foot of it, staring at the monitor with the expression of a man watching a chess match he didn't understand. "Get the crash cart," Katie said. Not a request. Her voice had dropped an octave. Command voice. The kind that made people move before they understood why. "The doctor is," one of the nurses started. "Now." The nurse ran. Dr. Sterling looked at her with something approaching contempt. "I have this under control, Ms. Morrison. Return to your station." Katie was already reading the monitor. The rhythm was chaotic. Electrical chaos in the heart muscle itself. She could see it in the peaks and valleys on the screen, the signs of something inside the chest cavity pressing against the heart, squeezing it into uselessness. Pericardial tamponade. The fluid sac around the heart filling with blood. The pressure crushing the ventricles. 3 years ago she'd seen this in the field. In a burning Humvee en route Tampa just outside Fallujah. A young soldier with shrapnel in his chest cavity bleeding into the space around his heart, and she'd had exactly 90 seconds to fix it before he went into cardiac arrest. She'd fixed it then with a needle and steady hands in the dark. The memory hit her like a physical blow. The smell of diesel fuel and copper. The heat from the burning engine block. The soldier's eyes, grey eyes, the color of storm clouds, the same eye she was looking at now in this fluorescent-lit room. Captain Morrison. The man she'd pulled from that Humvee. The man who'd written letters to her son's parents about how he died a hero. The same man, now, being watched while a doctor who'd never trained for this stood frozen. "I need an 18-gauge needle," Katie said. Her voice sounded like it belonged to someone else. Someone who'd been trained by the military to function in collapse. 1.5 inches. "And a syringe." "You are not a physician," Dr. Sterling said. His voice carried the weight of institutional authority. "Step away from the patient." The crash cart arrived. The nurse pushed it toward the bed, her eyes flicking between Dr. Sterling and Katie with the calculation of someone choosing which authority to obey. Captain Morrison's oxygen saturation was dropping. 78 on the monitor. 75, the numbers were falling like a countdown. Katie reached for the needle kit. Dr. Sterling moved to block her. His hand came up, not aggressive, but possessive. A claim on a space that wasn't his to claim anymore. She didn't step back. She didn't ask permission. She simply moved around him the way water moves around a stone. Her hands were already opening the sterile field. The needle gleamed under the overhead lights like a tiny instrument of mercy. "Security," Dr. Sterling said into the phone at the bedside. "I need security too." Katie wasn't listening anymore. She was in Fallujah. She was in the dark. The ventilator on the monitor was playing the same rhythm as the burning Humvee's engine. Her fingers located the landmarks, the second intercostal space, the midclavicular line. The anatomy was the same. The physics was identical. Blood in the pericardium. Pressure on the heart. The only medicine was drainage. She felt the needle slide through the skin. Through the muscle. Into the fluid sac. The hiss came immediately. Air and fluid escaping under pressure. The rush of relief in the vacuum. The monitor changed. The chaotic rhythm began to organize itself. Like a crowd finding its rhythm. Like chaos recognizing order. 84, the oxygen number climbed. She withdrew the needle. Pressure bandage. Standard protocol. Her movements were muscle memory encoded so deep it was genetic. This wasn't Katie Morrison, the hospital nurse performing a procedure she'd learned from textbooks. This was Senior Chief Petty Officer Morrison executing a life-saving intervention she'd performed 17 times in field conditions where there was no crash cart and no backup. The monitor steadied. The rhythm organized into something the heart could actually use. 89, 91. 94, stable. Captain Morrison's eyes fluttered. His color changed from ashen to something almost alive. The oxygen was flowing again. The heart could pump. The blood could move. The room went completely still. Not the absence of sound, the presence of recognition. The nurses stared at her hands like those hands belonged to someone they'd never actually seen before. Dr. Sterling's face had drained of color. His institutional authority looked very small all of a sudden, and he seemed to understand this. One of the nurses whispered something to the other. Katie didn't catch it. She didn't need to. She was already stepping back. Already removing the gloves with the precision of someone erasing evidence. "You performed a procedure you are not licensed for," Dr. Sterling said. His voice had changed. It was thinner now. Reedy. The voice of a man who understood that something fundamental had just shifted in the room's power structure. "I saved a life," Katie said. "You overstepped." She met his eyes. 1 second. Long enough for him to see something in hers. Not anger. Not defiance. Something older. Something forged in places he'd only read about. She looked away first, not from weakness, but from indifference. The way a soldier stops looking at an enemy who's already surrendered. The next morning, a disciplinary letter was waiting in Katie's locker. It was printed on official hospital letterhead. It detailed violations of scope of practice. It referenced regulations from the state nursing board. It was carefully constructed by someone who understood how to weaponize bureaucracy. It gave her 48 hours to respond before the termination became official. What Dr. Sterling didn't understand yet was that the night shift nurse on the IT desk, a Marine Corps veteran named Marcus who'd served 2 tours in Helmand Province, had saved every frame of security footage from room 304. He'd watched the entire sequence on the monitor in the surveillance office. He'd seen what Katie had done. More importantly, he'd seen what Dr. Sterling had done. How he'd frozen. How he'd tried to prevent a life-saving intervention. Marcus had also been saving other things. Records. Invoices. Shipping manifests from a medical supply company that showed charges 3 times what equipment should cost. Billing codes that didn't match actual procedures. The entire architecture of the kickback scheme that Dr. Sterling had been running for 4 years, the scheme that Katie's presence alone, with her meticulous charting and her eye for detail, had threatened to expose. But Katie didn't know any of this yet. Not on the morning she opened the termination letter. Not on the day she cleaned out her locker. Not on the evening when she stood at the bus stop on Ash Street in the rain, holding a cardboard box that contained everything she'd accumulated in her brief attempt to be a normal person. A cracked mug from the hospital gift shop. A succulent that was already dying. A photograph of her son in dress uniform, the only proof that she'd ever had a family, the only evidence that she'd ever been anything other than a ghost the government had trained and then ordered to forget her own name. She set the box down on the bench. The rain drummed against it like fingers tapping code. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that she couldn't disappear again. Not yet. Because Captain Morrison had seen her face when she was performing that procedure. He'd seen the military bearing in her movements. He'd heard the terminology slip out in her voice when she called for the needle and the drainage protocol. He knew something about her that didn't match the simple hospital nurse narrative. And by morning, he would have his memory clear enough to start asking questions. Dr. Sterling's hands trembled as he reached for his phone at 6:02 a.m., 3 minutes after Captain Morrison's heart monitor had stabilized to a steady rhythm that felt like a personal betrayal. The thing about men with money was their willingness to spend it to protect their secrets. He had spent the last 18 years building a network of favors, 3 board members whose children attended private schools because of his recommendations, whose vacation homes had been financed through convenient consulting contracts, whose portfolios had mysteriously outperformed the market. He started dialing. "Richard, it's Sterling. Oak Creek Memorial. I need a favor called in. Now." His voice carried the weight of someone accustomed to being obeyed. The first board member listened. The second listened and agreed to contact the hospital administrator directly. The third one, Bancroft, who had made nearly $200,000 over 5 years routing supply contracts through Sterling's preferred vendors, didn't even ask questions. "Consider it done," Bancroft said, and Sterling felt the first thread of control slip back into his hands. But the real problem wasn't the board members. The real problem was that nurse. Katie Morrison had spent 6 minutes performing a procedure that required the kind of muscle memory that didn't come from hospital training programs. Every movement had been economical, purposeful, performed with the calm authority of someone who had done this before. Multiple times. The needle insertion at the 5th intercostal space was too precise. The angle too practiced. The way she'd checked for pulsus paradoxus before the procedure, the way she'd called out the cardiac index numbers, those weren't skills you learned from online certification courses. Those were skills you learned in a field hospital in Kandahar. Or Fallujah. Or somewhere the military didn't put on employment applications. Sterling had spent his entire career studying people carefully enough to exploit them. He had studied Katie Morrison and found something dangerous, a person with training that existed outside the normal hierarchies that governed hospitals. A person who might notice that his supply company had been billing Oak Creek Memorial for 847 units of surgical trays at a unit cost of $412 when the wholesale price was $89. A person with the kind of focus that would eventually wonder why arterial lines cost 3 times what they should. She had to go. Not gently. Not through a performance improvement plan she might weather with her quiet dignity. She had to be dismantled completely. By 8:13 a.m., Sterling had called her 3 references. The first, a supervisor from a clinic in Portland, had long since retired and would be confused but eager to please. Sterling implied Katie had suffered from episodes of concerning judgment. The second, a contact from a military hospital, Sterling didn't ask how she'd worked in a military hospital, was surprisingly difficult to reach. The third one simply hung up on him. But it didn't matter. Once the narrative started moving, once the words unstable and questionable judgment entered the hospital ecosystem, they would spread like an infection. By 9:22 a.m., he had contracted an outside investigator named Caldwell, a man who had never met Katie Morrison and who would never care whether his investigation was honest. Caldwell specialized in performance documentation for institutions that needed their legal exposure minimized. Sterling provided the framework. An RN had performed a procedure outside her scope of practice during an emergency situation. The pericardiocentesis, technically an invasive cardiovascular intervention, should have been performed by a physician or a critical care specialist. The fact that Katie had saved a man's life was irrelevant. The fact that every emergency medicine protocol in the country allowed for nurse-performed procedures in code situations was irrelevant. Caldwell would write the narrative Sterling needed, and the hospital administrator would sign it because he understood how liability worked, and board members would support it because they understood how their summer homes worked. Katie didn't know any of this yet. She was still tending to Captain Morrison's recovery, still checking his vitals, still documenting his care in that meticulous way of hers that had first drawn Sterling's attention. He watched her from the physician's lounge at 9:38 a.m., watched her adjust the flow rate on his floor with the kind of precision that made him want to scream. Every movement was proof that she had trained at a level that exceeded her job title. Every movement was a threat. The termination letter was drafted and approved by 10:51 a.m. It would arrive on her employment file by 1:06 p.m., and the administrator would call her into his office at 1:38 p.m. to hand-deliver it. Standard protocol for final terminations due to gross violation of scope of practice. Sterling had seen it done before. He had seen nurses walk out of hospitals in shock, walking out of their livelihoods in the span of 30 minutes. Katie accepted the termination without argument at 1:51 p.m. That was the moment Sterling relaxed slightly. She didn't fight. She didn't ask questions. She simply nodded, removed her hospital badge from around her neck, and set it on the administrator's desk with the kind of care one might use setting down a sleeping child. The administrator looked uncomfortable. He should have. By 2:22 p.m., Katie was at her locker in the nurse's break room, placing a few personal items into a cardboard box that had held a delivery for tubing. A cracked mug that said San Diego Fleet Week 2019 in fading letters. A small succulent that she'd kept alive for 4 years, now drying at the edges from the recycled air of the hospital. A photograph in a simple frame, her son in dress uniform, smile wide, standing in front of the San Diego Naval Base. The only proof she'd ever had a life before the government erased her. Nobody watched her leave. Nobody said goodbye. That was how it worked sometimes. You disappeared from people's lives the same way you disappeared from records, quietly, completely, leaving barely a ripple. The rain started as she reached the bus stop 6 blocks from Oak Creek Memorial, a cold Pacific drizzle that soaked through her jacket in seconds. She set the cardboard box down on the metal bench, still wearing her scrubs because there hadn't seemed to be any point in changing, and closed her eyes against the downpour. The rain hammered against her face like small accusations. You didn't flinch. You didn't fight back. You didn't do anything to save yourself. Thunder rolled across the city like the echo of distant artillery. Katie opened her eyes and stared at the photograph through the cardboard box's open flap. Her son's smile, frozen in time, frozen 3 years ago in a place she'd almost escaped from. He would have been 24 now. He might have gone to college. He might have fallen in love. He might have done any of the 1,000 things that people got to do when their commanding officers didn't take them into a firefight in Jolin District without backup. She could walk away. She had walked away from worse situations than this. She had extracted herself from compounds with nothing but a knife and a prayer. She had survived interrogations that broke bones and spirits with equal efficiency. A hospital job, a cardboard box of belongings, a vindictive doctor. These were minor obstacles in the vast machinery of suffering she had learned to navigate. She could disappear completely. Not just from Oak Creek Memorial, but from San Diego. From California. She could cross into Mexico with the cash in her locker, $743, enough to get her somewhere quiet, and she could become someone else again. A third identity. A fourth. How many times could one person be erased before erasure became permanent? Katie reached for the photograph. The glass was cold. She turned it face down, unable to look at her son smile, unable to reconcile the woman who had given him life with the woman who had trained to survive its loss. She thought about throwing the whole box into the rain-slicked street. She thought about watching it dissolve, letting the ink run and the photograph soften and the frame crack until nothing was left but cardboard pulp and the memory of a person who no longer existed. That was when she heard it. The sound came first as a rumble, distant and metallic, the kind of sound that civilians probably didn't even notice. But Katie's entire body recognized it instantly. The rotor wash of a Black Hawk helicopter, maybe 2 miles out, maybe less. Coming closer. Coming through the rain. She set the photograph down carefully on the bench beside the box. Her hands had stopped shaking. The rotor wash hit the parking lot like a hammer dropping from the sky. The Black Hawk landed at 6:56 a.m., rotors still spinning, kicking up dust that coated the windows of Oak Creek Memorial in a haze of desert sand and military purpose. Nurses stopped mid-stride. Orderlies froze. The entire hospital felt the vibration in their sternum before they understood what they were looking at. 2 officers in dress uniforms strode through the lobby like they owned it. Their boots echoed on the tile with a rhythm that made the front desk staff sit straighter. They approached the information desk without asking, Navy officers with the bearing of men who didn't request things. "We need to speak with Chief Morrison." The senior officer's voice carried the weight of command structure. "Not a question. Call sign designation only. She's here. Now." The receptionist blinked. "I'm sorry, we don't have anyone by that. Check again." Dr. Sterling appeared in the hallway leading from the East Wing, his tailored suit already beginning to wrinkle. He'd spent the night on the administrative phone, calling in favors, ensuring the disciplinary paperwork moved fast. Katie Morrison was supposed to be gone. She was supposed to be packed and erased and forgotten, like all the other loose ends he'd managed to tie off in his 15 years at Oak Creek. But Captain James Morrison was awake in room 304. And he heard every word. He stood from his bed on trembling legs, hospital gown tied at the back, for line swinging. The cardiac monitor beeped steady as he moved into the hallway with the measured pace of a man who'd learned to move through pain years ago. His voice cut through the lobby, sharp and clear enough to halt the officers mid-stride. "That nurse holds the rank of Senior Chief Petty Officer." The words detonated in the silence. It wasn't a request. It was a command. Dr. Sterling's face paled. His hand moved toward his pocket, toward his phone, but he was frozen, paralyzed by the realization that something was happening that he could not control through his network of favors and threats. The hospital administrator, a man named Hendricks who had always considered Sterling a useful ally, appeared with Katie's personnel file trembling in his hands. He'd been summoned by the officers. He'd been shown credentials that made his blood pressure spike. Hendricks opened the file with fumbling fingers. His voice wavered as he read aloud. Bronze Star for Valor Under Fire, 2009. Bronze Star for Leadership During Classified Operation, 2014. Purple Heart, 2015. Purple Heart, 2016. Each medal fell into the silence like a stone into still water. A Navy SEAL commander stepped forward, the kind of man whose uniform carried the weight of command at the highest levels. His eyes found Katie across the lobby. And he began to name her decorations the way a priest names saints. Silver Star for Valor in Baghdad, Operation Inherent Resolve, 2014. Navy Cross for saving 12 men under fire, including the captain standing here. That's the second highest combat decoration in the United States military. He turned to Dr. Sterling. His stare could have cracked concrete. And anyone who interferes with an officer of that rank faces federal obstruction charges. Dr. Sterling's face drained of color entirely. His mouth opened. Closed. The smell of his cologne, expensive, aggressive, seemed suddenly pathetic in the clinical air of the hospital he'd run like a personal fiefdom. Katie stood in the middle of the lobby in borrowed scrubs, and the entire geometry of the space shifted. The officers stood at attention. Captain Morrison remained in his hospital gown, and he did not look away from her face. Behind them, a young man in marine dress blue stepped forward from the group. He was the IT specialist, the one who'd been quietly working in the hospital server room, the one Sterling had dismissed 100 times as just another tech kid. But he was more than that. Dr. Sterling attempted to delete security footage from the East Wing hallway at 11:39 p.m. last night, the Marine said, his voice steady as procedure. Attempted to destroy the video record of his interactions with Chief Morrison over the past 6 weeks. I recovered every frame. I also recovered his email traffic regarding the inflated billing with Meridian Medical Supply, that's $847,000 in fraudulent charges since 2018. I forwarded everything to the FBI field office in San Diego at 3:22 a.m. Agents are arriving within the hour. Dr. Sterling moved. His hand came up. His mouth opened as if to speak, to deny, to activate some final leverage. But his phone was already ringing. The FBI field office in Los Angeles. His home phone. His attorney's office, lighting up with incoming calls. The lobby filled with the sound of his breathing, fast now, panicked, nothing like the controlled breathing of a man accustomed to power. 6 months later, someone spotted him at a strip mall in Tucson, Arizona. He was standing behind a folding table in front of an urgent care clinic, selling supplemental insurance policies to walk-in customers. His name tag read, Steve. Not Doctor. Not Sterling. Just Steve. When someone asked if he was a physician, he flinched. The kind of flinch that meant the question had been asked before. Many times. The folding table wobbled when he set the paperwork down. His hands weren't quite steady. He'd lost his medical license 6 weeks into the federal investigation. The medical board hearing lasted 3 hours. The evidence was categorical. The witnesses, every nurse he'd humiliated, every patient he'd overcharged through inflated supply costs, they testified with the precision of people who'd been waiting years for an opportunity to speak truth. Back at Oak Creek Memorial, Katie Morrison stood in her dress blues in the hospital chapel. The fabric was crisp, the creases sharp enough to cut. Captain Morrison held a pair of worn combat boots in his hands. The leather was scuffed and scarred. Pieces of shrapnel still embedded in the heel from the night 3 years ago when Katie had pulled him out of a burning Humvee in Baghdad, her hand steady and her voice calling out vitals that kept him conscious long enough for the medevac to arrive. "I carried these the entire time I was looking for you," Captain Morrison said. His voice trembled slightly, the only trembling that was allowed. "Every deployment. Every mission. I knew someday I'd find the nurse who saved my life. I just didn't know it would take a cardiac tamponade and a Navy SEAL commander to make it happen." Katie took the boots. The leather was warm from his hands. The weight of them was nothing compared to the weight she'd been carrying, the weight of erasure, of invisibility, of being officially dead in every government database while she walked the earth keeping people alive. She finally allowed herself to cry. Not a single tear of composure during public humiliation. But real tears, the kind that come when armor is finally removed and the weight is finally shared with someone who understands what it means to carry that kind of secret. Captain Morrison saluted her. He stood at attention in his hospital gown with his fur lines still attached, and he saluted the way soldiers salute their commanding officers. He saluted the woman who'd saved his life. And he saluted the memory of her son, his soldier, his responsibility, his failure that he'd been trying to redeem ever since that night in Baghdad when the same operation that took her boy had handed her the captain she was meant to save. The hospital board announced the changes within a week. A new Veterans Affairs Liaison Office opened on the 3rd floor. Pro bono trauma care for military personnel. New oversight protocols for supply contracts and billing. And they offered Katie Morrison the position of Chief of Trauma Services. Full authority. Full compensation. Full visibility. But she returned to the floor in scrubs at 6:44 a.m. the next Monday. She checked vitals on her patients with the precision that had always defined her. The cardiology floor. The trauma bay. The ICU. The places where lives hung in suspension and decisions mattered in increments of seconds. "Why didn't you take the office?" one of the newer nurses asked during shift change. Katie attached a monitor to the chest of a woman recovering from a myocardial infarction. "My fight is here now," she said simply. "Not behind a desk. Here." The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. The restraint of a woman who'd been given back her identity after 3 years of invisibility, who'd been offered power and chosen purpose instead. Scars tell stories. And Katie Morrison wore hers on the inside where it mattered most. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your worth, if you've ever had to hide who you really are to survive, share this video with someone who needs to know that the quiet person in the room might just be the one holding everything together. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the next story of the ones who deserve better.